Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to a new unit titled Political and Constitutional Development in Nigeria. So here we're going to discuss all of the political developments that Nigeria has made in a political system right from the pre-colonial era down to the present day. Okay, so we're going to begin with the pre-colonial administration in Nigeria. So here we're going to discuss all of the political systems and institutions that were present in the Nigerian territory before the British came to colonize Nigeria. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the My School channel. Like I said earlier, we're moving on to pre-colonial administration in Nigeria. So let's dive right into it. Alright, so here's a list of things we're going to be discussing in this video lesson. We're going to begin with the introduction to Nigeria's pre-colonial atmosphere. Then we're going to discuss the 5 different kingdoms and political institutions that were present in Nigeria before the British came to colonize Nigeria. So let's begin with an introduction to Nigeria's pre-colonial atmosphere. So contrary to the belief of the European colonialists, Nigeria's pre-colonial system had a political and social structure. So when the British came to Nigeria, there was the belief that Nigeria had nothing. There was no political system, no structure of governing the society before they came. But this is not the case. Traditional political institutions were operating in indigenous societies with their well-structured constitutional framework. And this means that they were institutions in place that govern the society. When we're talking about institutions, we're talking about those systems of governments that helps in administrating the affairs of the state or the territory in that society. In this particular case, we have the legislature, the executive, and the judicial system within the pre-colonial Nigerian society. Then we also had officials with designated responsibilities who administer the affairs of the state. We have people who were given responsibilities to do different things within the society, to make laws, to enforce the laws, to maintain law and order within the society, and also to administer punishment to lawbreakers within the society. There was also separation of power to prevent the concentration of power. So we talked about how we have legislative, executive, and judicial functions in this pre-colonial society. We also had checks and balances. Each of these different arms of government were checking on one another to ensure that there was no abuse of power. So all of these things were existent in pre-colonial society. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, in the territory that later came to be known as Nigeria, over 250 ethnic groups occupied the landscape, but the major ethnic groups with well-established political systems include all 5 of these. So the reason why we're going to discuss only 5 major political systems is because there's not much information about the other territories within the Nigerian society. The ones that were recorded were these 5 institutions, and so we're going to discuss them in detail. We're going to begin with the Hausa/Fulani Emirates. All right, the Hausa/Fulani Emirates had their history recorded right from the 9th century. The Hausa/Fulani pre-colonial political system can be traced back to the 9th century with the establishment of city-states known as the Hausa Bakwai. So the Hausa Bakwai means 7 legitimate Hausa states. Then these 7 city-states includes Dora, Kano, Katsina, Zazzau or Zaria, Gobia, Rano, and Biram. So they were also the Banza Bakwai, or the 7 illegitimate Hausa states. So these states were not ruled by any of the sons of these Bayajida. Instead, they were ruled by other people. They conquered these 7 states and established them as part of the Hausa states during that time. So we have Zamfara, Kebbi, Yori, Gwari, Nupe, Ilorin, and Kwara Rafa. So each of the Hausa city-states was politically autonomous and governed by a ruler known as the Saken. So each of the 14 states that we've discussed so far, they had a ruler known as the Saken or king. So he was the one who ruled the states during that period. So despite their independence, the Hausa states shared a similar political structure, which was a monarchical system, an organized bureaucracy, and military might. A monarchical system in the sense that it was ruled by a king, a Saken. Then it has organized bureaucracy in the sense that they had officials who had designated responsibilities within each of the states. And these responsibilities were organized in a hierarchical structure. The ones at the lower level were reporting to those at the upper level. So they had a structure during that era. And then there was also military might. They had a military that helped to defend the state against external aggression. The Saki was advised by a council of nobles, and governance was based on traditional customs and laws specific to each state. So this is the legislative function we're talking about. They had laws that governed the society. These laws were based on their traditional customs, those things that have been pre-existing in the society and that have been guiding them in how they should behave with respect to one another within the society. So they also had an economy. The economy of the states was largely based on agriculture, trade, and crafts. So they were basically farmers, and they sold whatever crops they had with one another. They also created different types of crafts. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, there was a change in the 11th century. Islam began to take roots in the Hausa states from around the 11th century, initially through trade routes linking the Sahara and the Sahel regions. So what we're going to talk about here is how the Fulani came to flood the Hausa states. The Fulani, as we all know, are nomads. They moved from one place to another. And what they did was to establish trade routes. They sold goods and services from one territory they visited to another territory. So this was their culture, this was their way of life. And so when they came to the Hausa state, they brought along with them Islam. By the 14th century, many Hausa rulers began converting to Islam to strengthen ties with the larger Islamic world and to aid greater access to trade networks and political alliances. So when we are talking about this trade route between the Sahara and the Sahel, the Sahara is the region in northern Nigeria and Niger, and the Sahel region is the North African states. We're talking about Egypt, most of Sudan and other states. So these states were already Islamic states, and they were connected to the larger Islamic world. And when the Fulani came to establish this trade route between them, they had to convert to Islam in order to have a relationship with these states, right? And thus to the larger Islamic world, so that they can continue to trade with one another and to advance the Hausa states as a whole. So this transformation gradually turned the Hausa states into theocratic monarchies. So we've talked about theocracy as a system of government. Theocracy is a system of government where religious leaders rule. So these monarchies, these kings that were ruling the Hausa states at the time, they were theocratic in nature, in the sense that they converted to Islam, and so they added this, they started making use of Islamic laws and customs within their land. So it became a theocratic monarchy. So Islamic law, known as Sharia, coexisted with their traditional laws. By the 15th century, Fulani nomads began migrating into the Hausa region from Senegal and Futa Toro. So Senegal is in Eastern Africa, and they started migrating down to Nigeria. The Fulani were pastoralists, but also Islamic scholars and traders. So pastoralists, they were nomads, they moved from one place to another. They were also Islamic scholars. They were the ones who brought Islam to the Hausa states, and they were also traders. They were the ones that established the trade routes with the Sahel region and the larger Islamic world. So they became aristocrats in the Hausa courts, as they were indispensable to the kings because of their knowledge of Islam and the trade routes. So the Hausa kings could not do without the Fulani scholars. They were given places of honor in the Hausa courts. So this is also very important to note as we move on to the next century. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we have the 19th century, where there was the Fulani jihad and the rise of the Sokoto Caliphate. So there was a very popular, very historic event that happened in the 19th century. That was the Fulani jihad. And the reason for this jihad was the fact that the power dynamics between the Hausa kings and the Fulani aristocrats led to growing tension. So the sacking in these various Hausa states and the aristocrats, those people that they've let into the Hausa courts, they begin to have tensions between one another. And the reason for this is that many Fulani scholars believe that the Hausa rulers were only superficially Islamic. They were not true Muslims. And so because of that, they decided to engage in this jihad, this holy war. In 1804, Usman Danfodio launched a jihad, or a holy war, by mobilizing Fulani and Hausa followers to overthrow the ruling Hausa elites. The jihad spread across the region and led to the overthrow of several Hausa kings and the establishment of a centralized Islamic state. So when we're talking about a centralized Islamic state, we have a central power at the head, at the helm of affairs. They are the top of the hierarchy of authority. So by 1808, the jihad was victorious and the Sokoto Caliphate was established with its headquarters in Sokoto. The Sokoto Caliphate, which unified much of northern Nigeria under Islamic rule, was led by Usman Danfodio as the Caliph of Sokoto, and divided into emirates governed by emirs who were loyal to Sokoto. So we have various emirs. We have emir of Kano, of Zaria, and all the other states, but they were loyal to the Caliph Usman Dan Fodio. The Sokoto Caliphate became one of the largest and most influential Islamic empires in Africa until its eventual conquest by British forces in the early 20th century. So we're going to discuss that later on in another video lesson. So now let's move on to the political structure of the Hausa Fulani Emirates. So with the conquest of a considerable part of the old Hausa Kingdom of Nigeria during the Holy War, led by Usman Dan Fodio, the Fulanis established their emirates. Sokoto and Gwandu became the headquarters of the Fulani Empire. So they divided powers between these two different regions, Sokoto and Gwandu. Sokoto governed the eastern part of the empire and Gwandu governed for the west. But they were still together. The Emir of Gwandu still paid tribute to the Caliph of Sokoto. Emirs were appointed by Dan Fodio for Gombe, for Katsina, Yola, Kano, Zaria, Bauchi, Ilorin, Kotangora, Agogo, and other towns that owed allegiance and paid annual tribute to either Dan Fodio at Sokoto or the Emir at Gwandu. So this is how the power structure was during that time. At first, the Caliph of Sokoto chose emirs for the Emirates for the western part of the empire, but later appointments were made by the local people, but ratified by the headquarters. So the Caliph of Sokoto were appointing their emirs at first, but they allowed the local people to start appointing their emirs, but they had to approve the appointments at the headquarters. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, what is the system of trade in the Hausa Fulani Emirate? Of course, economy is important in a government. It's important to know how they are getting money to run the affairs of the states. So cities like Kano, Katsina, and Zaria in the Hausa Fulani Emirates were centrally located on the trans-Saharan trade route connecting West Africa to North Africa, when we're talking about Egypt and most of Sudan, and the Mediterranean. They got goods like salt, silk, and horses from North Africa, and exported items like cotton, indigo, kola nuts, shea nuts, grain, rice, tobacco, and onions. So this is how they got most of their wealth. So cities like Kano had thriving markets. Kano was especially known for its high-quality leather, famously called Moroccan leather, which was exported widely. Islam facilitated trade because it provided a shared language, which is Arabic. So this is the connection they had with the larger Islamic world. They were able to learn a language so that they can be able to communicate with the Islamic world and trade with them. They also provided a legal system that regulated commercial transactions. Fulani traders who brought Islam to the region became important trade intermediaries between the Hausa states and other Muslim merchants in Sahara and North Africa. The Hausa/Fulani Emirates participated in the slave trade. They captured slaves from neighboring regions and exported them via the trade route. And so that's how slave trade began in Africa. It was also present in other regions within the Nigerian society. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we are going to discuss the institutions and the officials. Remember, we talked about how this showed that there was a government in the Nigerian society. We had institutions, we had the supreme headquarters. Sokoto and Gwandu were the headquarters of the Hausa Fulani Emirates. Think of it as the federal government of the Hausa territory. The Emir of Gwandu controlled the Western Empire and the Emir of Sokoto controlled the Eastern Empire. They appointed emirs in each of the emirates under their jurisdiction. Now, you can also think of the district administration as the state governments. So each emirate was divided into districts for administrative convenience. An official known as Hakimi was usually appointed by the emir to administer the district and to collect taxes on behalf of the emir. So they paid allegiance to the emirs of Gwandu and Sokoto. Then we also had village head. You can think of the village head as the local government. The village heads were appointed by the Hakimi to help in the collection of taxes, e.g. cattle tax known as Jangali and land tax known as Haraji, and maintenance of law and order in the villages. So these were the institutions that were present in the Hausa states. Then we also had officials. The emir was at the helm of affairs. He was responsible for making laws, enforcing laws, and maintaining peace and order in his emirates. So this is sort of an absolute monarchy in the sense that he had legislative, executive, and judicial function. This does not mean that there were no checks and balances, as we're going to discuss later on. He administered his emirate in keeping with the basic canons of Islamic law and the Sharia. He was both the political and spiritual leader of the people. Then we had the Waziri. The Waziri was the prime minister or chief advisor to the emir. He acted as the right-hand man and helped in the administration of the states. It's a little bit similar to the constitutional monarchy we have in the British society, where power is divided between the absolute monarchy, the king or the queen, and the prime minister. But in this case, the king has more power, but he just assigns some responsibilities to the waziri to implement some of the policies that he has created himself. Then we have the Madawakin, who is the commander of the cavalry or the army's chief general. He is the chief of the army. We have the Dogari, who was the head of the royal bodyguards. And we have the Maji, who was the treasurer of the Emirates. We have Sakin Rawa, who was the river fishing official. We had the Sakin Father, who was the head of the palace staff. And then we have Sakin Power, who was the head of all the butchers. So these were the officials that were present in the Hausa Fulani Emirates. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to discuss the separation of powers and checks and balances that were present in the Emirates. So for the legislative functions, we had Islamic laws, which were the supreme laws of the Emirates. The Emir had the capacity of making laws on matters which were not covered by the Islamic law. So the Islamic law was the central governing power within the states. It was sort of their constitution at the time. Then we have executive functions. The Emir was authoritarian and had absolute powers, even though he had a body of advisors. He can choose to accept or ignore their advice. The Emir appointed the officials who were responsible for administering the affairs of the state. He provided social welfare services for the people, and he organized these people for defense of the Emirates against external attacks. And he also imposed and collected taxes and tributes. These taxes and tributes is what he uses to administer the affairs of the states. Then we have judiciary functions. The Sharia law was applied in all the Emirates. An alkali who should be trained in the Quranic and Sharia law acted as the sole judge for each court. So they had courts in each of the Emirates, and it was headed by the alkali. It's kind of like the chief justice of each of these Emirates. Most of the clauses of the Sharia law dealt mainly with civic matters. That means problems with the relationship with the various inhabitants of the region. Then we have land and serious criminal cases which were tried in the emir's courts. And the village headman tried minor disputes and criminal offenses at the village level. So this is how they interpreted law and punished law breakers in the Hausa Fulani Emirates. So we've come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. I believe it was educative and enlightening. If you would like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There you can continue on this journey with us. So we're going to discuss all the other 4 kingdoms or political institutions in detail and discuss how they were separation of power and checks and balances in each of these political institutions. I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.